Before I begin, I would like to say that this show may be perceived as anti-Masonic. I am not a Mason and never have been. While it is true that I am a Christian and I would never join the Freemasons, I have researched the Freemasons, but I study various topics I become intrigued by. That being said, I don't believe the information I present in this video is inherently anti-Masonic. This show will look at the film 2001: A Space Odyssey and how it appears to be a Masonic allegorical fantasy. I will use excerpts from Masonic books and they will be in context. Information about secret societies is not hard to find online, but it does require much research and a focused mind, which is necessary to filter out prejudices and praises from what is out there to get a clear picture. That is why when I make any video, I try not to be too biased. I let the information speak for itself. I try to be transparent and disclose truthfully that these are my opinions, but when I make these opinions, I make sure that my claims hold up to scrutiny. There is a claim made often that the Illuminati or Freemasons are determined to undermine events for their own selfish interests and world control. I cannot prove or disprove this, so I don't talk about it. What is 2001: A Space Odyssey about? Here is what Kubrick said in an interview with Joseph Gelmas in 1969. You begin with an artifact left on Earth 4 million years ago by extraterrestrial explorers who observed the behavior of the man-apes of the time and decided to influence their evolutionary progression. Then you have a second artifact buried deep on the lunar surface and programmed to signal word of man's first baby steps into the universe, a kind of cosmic burglar alarm. And finally, there's a third artifact placed in orbit around Jupiter and waiting for the time when man has reached the outer rim of his own solar system. When the surviving astronaut, Bowman, ultimately reaches Jupiter, this artifact sweeps him into a force field or stargate that hurls him on a journey through inner and outer space and finally transports him to another part of the galaxy, where he's placed in a human zoo approximating a hospital, terrestrial environment drawn out of his own dreams and imagination. In a timeless state, his life passes from middle age to senescence to death. He is reborn an enhanced being, a star child, an angel, a Superman if you like, and returns to Earth prepared for the next leap forward of man's evolutionary destiny. Simple enough, eh? What's it got to do with the Masons? Let's back up just a little bit. In 1957, Looney Tunes retold the classic Three Little Pigs story as a hip, jazzy musical called The Three Little Bobs. It's a very curious cartoon, but it explains 2001: A Space Odyssey. If you're familiar with the classic story of the Three Little Pigs, you know the pigs have 3 houses, one of straw, one of sticks, and the last of bricks. The big bad wolf could huff and puff and blow the first 2 down, but had difficulty with the latter. In the Three Little Bops, the first structure is built with straw, and the little pigs, or bops, are playing as musicians for the club. In comes a wolf, but he just wants to play with the band, only he really can't play. He's not good enough so he's promptly thrown out of the club. The wolf is upset at this and successfully blows down the club with a blast from his trumpet. The second structure, which is built with sticks, is called the Dewdrop Inn. It is a clever play on words because it has 3 meanings. The first is a literal meaning, which is that it is a hotel. The second is a pun, dewdrop in, as in come on in. But the third meaning is with the word dew, which is also the phonetic pronunciation of the French word for two. Yet again the Bobs are playing and the wolf wishes to join them only to be quickly rebuffed for his lack of musical ability. Once again the wolf is upset at this and successfully blows down the club with a blast from his trumpet. The third structure is built with bricks, and it has a neon sign which flashes off and on, dine dance. Again we have a phonetic pronunciation of the word dine, which is German for the, so the name of this place is The Dance. What is interesting is that at the cornerstone is a date May 1, 1776. This is the date which is attributed to the creation of the Illuminati by Adam Weishaupt. It isn't a conspiracy theory, look it up, that's the day. And chances are you've seen a Masonic cornerstone. They always have it in the northeastern corner, by the way. The Bops are playing, and the wolf is thrown out yet again, only this time, since he cannot blow the structure down with his trumpet, he will use TNT, however he fails to make it to the target in time, and ends up blowing himself up. The wolf dies and ends up in hell. Somehow, as a resident of the abode of the damned, the wolf is now gifted with powers of great musical prowess, and he joins the Bops. You gotta get hot to play real cool. So to explain the story, it is after 3 tries and resurrection of a sort that the wolf is able to join the brothers at the Illuminati structure. In a booklet printed in London 1725 entitled The Grand Mystery of Freemasonry is the following statement. If a master mason you would be, observe you well the rule of 3. What does this mean? Let's think about the 3 little bops for a moment. It was after 3 tries that the wolf was triumphant. He got what he wanted. He was able to join the hip little bops. The number 3 is very important in Freemasonry. I won't go into detail about that, but the first 3 degrees of Freemasonry are the most integral. This ritual of 3 degrees is conferred in what is called the Blue Lodge. The first degree is the entered apprentice, the second degree is fellowcraft, the third degree is master mason. There is no higher degree than the master mason or the third degree. It is in my opinion, after studying Freemasonry, is that it is a hybrid of Egyptian mythology and Judeo-Christian writings. I have always speculated the possibility of some unbroken chain which linked Freemasonry or the Rosicrucians to Egypt, but the farthest one can trace these groups back is the Templars, which leaves a big gap in time. What is interesting is that the writers of Freemasonic literature, such as Albert Mackey, speak about their craft in such a way that it seems the main message of the allegory is that there is a distinction between the Christians and non-Christians, and they knowingly are not Christians. It doesn't make much sense to me, but there it is. One example is a password they use, Tubal Cain. This is a descendant of Cain. They associate themselves with Cain, one of the children of Adam and Eve, in the first chapters of Genesis.
A famous Mason. The outstanding figure in modern Freemasonry is undoubtedly the widow's son, who is known to members of the fraternity under the somewhat obscure name of Hiram Abiff. So is Hiram Abiff the iconic widow's son? It is true that Master Masons are raised in the image of Hiram Abiff, and many understand this to be the reason they are referred to as sons of the widow. Seldom discussed, however, is the question, who is the widow? Or better yet, who was the father? What is perhaps the oldest Masonic legend is known as the Legend of the Craft, from which we will now hear a few excerpts, bearing in mind that while nowadays few Masons actually believe this quasi-biblical legend, the early Masons took it quite literally. As Albert Mackey said, this narrative, up to the end of the 17th century, claimed and received the implicit faith of the craft, and, even in the 19th century, has had its advocates among the learned, and its credence among the unlearned of the craft. The Legend of the Craft. How this worthy science was first begun, I shall tell. Before Noah's flood, there was a man named Lamech, as it is written in the 4th chapter of Genesis, whose 4 children founded the beginning of all crafts in the world. Jubal was the elder son, and he found the craft of geometry. His brother, Jubal, found the craft of music. The 3rd brother, Tubal Cain, found out smith's craft to work iron and steel, and their sister, Naamah, found out the art of weaving. These children knew well that God would take vengeance for sin, or destroy humanity, either by fire or by water, wherefore they writ the science they had found in 2 pillars of stone, that they might be found after Noah's flood. And that one stone was marble, for that would not burn with fire, and that other stone was clept laterns, a stone that was said to float, and would not drown in no water. The legend then relates that after the flood, Hermes, the father of wise men, he found one of the 2 pillars of stone, and found the science written there, and he taught it to other men. As for the 4 children of Lamech, none is more central to Masonry than Tubal Cain. Tubal Cain, the celebrated forefather of Masonry, was also the forefather of Hiram Abiff. As his name would imply, he was also a descendant of Cain, for Tubal Cain means offspring of Cain. So then, according to both the Bible and the Masonic legend, the craft had its origin in the bloodline of Cain. This has always been an open secret, and for some an open wound, both painful and unsightly, so they have attempted to cover it up, going so far as to claim that Lamech was of the line of Seth. Of course, it should be obvious that if Lamech was descended from Seth, he would never have named his child offspring of Cain. Others have claimed the science originated with Adam, who taught it to his sons, and that it was passed on through Seth, not Cain. However, this is contradicted by the original Masonic legend and by the Bible upon which this legend is based. Returning now to Hiram Abiff, we find that there is much dispute as to the origin of the third degree, and the Hiramic legend taught therein. As we shall see, the evidence suggests that these were introduced to the craft by the influence of the Rosicrucians through the instrumentality of Francis Bacon and King James. The Rosicrucian temple legend is quite similar to the Masonic version, but with greater detail, and with many important keys not contained in the Hiramic legend, but which are, nonetheless, of the greatest significance to Masonry. At one point in the legend, as Hiram is attempting to cast his masterwork, the so-called Molten Sea, he finds he has been sabotaged by 3 jealous apprentices. A disaster occurs, and the unchecked metal flows like lava over the temple floor. As Hiram tries in vain to check the flow with water, a mysterious figure appears above him, saying, "Come, my son, be without fear. I have rendered thee incombustible. Cast thyself into the flames." The credulous Hiram jumps in. Then asks the voice, "Whither do you take me?" The voice answers, "Into the center of the earth, into the soul of the world, into the kingdom of the great Cain, where liberty reigns with him. There the tyrannous envy of Adonai ceases. There can we, despising his anger, taste the fruit of the tree of knowledge. There is the home of my fathers. Who then am I, and who art thou? I am the father of thy fathers. I am the son of Lamech. I am Tubal-Cain." Tubal-Cain introduced Hiram into the sanctuary of fire, where he expounded to him the weakness of Adonai and the base passions of that god, the enemy of his own creature. Hiram was then led into the presence of the author of his race, Cain. Cain related to Hiram his experiences, sufferings, and misfortunes brought upon him by the implacable Adonai. Tubal-Cain then bestowed his hammer to Hiram, saying, "Thanks to this hammer, and the help of the genie of fire, thou shalt speedily accomplish the work left unfinished through man's stupidity and malignity." With the help of his newfound ability, Hiram successfully completes his masterpiece, only to be promptly murdered by the same unworthy apprentices. So then, is Cain to be understood as the progenitor of Masonry? Not quite. That prize can be awarded to his father, who, according to the legend, is not Adam. We shall now quote from the beginning of the temple legend as given by Steiner. The ancestry of the builders of the mystical temple was as follows. One of the Elohim, or primitive genii, married Eve and had a son called Cain, whilst Jehovah, or Adonai, another of the Elohim, created Adam and united him with Eve to bring forth the family of Abel, to whom were subjected the sons of Cain as punishment for the transgression of Eve. Thus we see that Cain is a direct descendant of the gods, but Abel is a descendant of Adam and Eve, who are human. Cain committed fratricide. He killed Abel, and for this he was excluded from communion with Yahweh. He went away into distant lands and founded his own race there. Adam again united with Eve, and from this union came Seth, also mentioned in the Bible, who took over the role of Abel. Thus we have 2 generations of mankind, the race of Cain, who was a descendant of Eve and one of the Elohim, and the other race, which had human parentage, and was brought into existence at the command of Yahweh.
And in apocryphal literature, there is a story about 2 Pillars of Enoch. The story is told here by the famous historian Josephus Flavius, and that their inventions might not be lost before they were sufficiently known, upon Adam's prediction that the world was to be destroyed at one time by the force of fire, and at another time by the violence and quantity of water, they made 2 pillars, the one of brick, the other of stone. They inscribed their discoveries on them both, that in case the pillar of brick should be destroyed by the flood, the pillar of stone might remain, and exhibit those discoveries to mankind, and also informed them that there was another pillar of brick erected by them. Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus Flavius. I place an emphasis on the words stone and brick because it is my belief that the pillars of Freemasonry, which can be seen on Masonic tracing boards with the letters S and B, do not stand for strength and beauty as they claim, but stone and brick. Why is this important? Because there is this obsession with the antediluvian world, the world before the flood. In fact, I believe that Atlantis is simply another word for the world before the flood. This period is one of great intrigue to all true scholars of ancient history. It is a peculiar nostalgia. One of the reasons the show Ancient Aliens is so cool is that they focus on this time period. And an assessment of the show is that it's about communication from otherworldly creatures and mankind. It was in this period the pyramids were probably built, and many of the mythologies of old began. The myths of the Greeks, Egyptians, and Sumerians were no doubt stories passed on about the events that occurred in the antediluvian period. One story in particular, which is of importance, is the story of Isis and Osiris.
Now, the children of Heb and Nut are first Isis and Osiris. This is the goddess Isis. She is the throne on which the pharaoh sits. She is the throne. Here is Osiris, her twin brother. They are husband and wife. This is Nephthys, who is the wife of Set, who is the other brother, the younger brother and sister, Set and Nephthys. Now, in a famous night, Osiris slept with Nephthys, thinking she was Isis. This is inattention to details, and from things of that kind, bad results can follow. She then bore a child who was known as Anubis, and he had the head of a jackal. But Set didn't like this, and he planned revenge. The revenge was to take perfect measurements of Osiris and to have a sarcophagus fashioned that would fit him exactly. And a jolly party was in full progress when Set comes in and says, I have this beautiful sarcophagus, and anyone whom it fits can have it. So it's like Cinderella and the glass slipper. They all try the sarcophagus. And when Osiris is in it, it fits perfectly, and 72 attendants come rushing in, clap their lid on the sarcophagus, wrap iron bands around it, and throw it into the Nile. So there goes Osiris down the Nile. He's washed ashore in Syria, and a great tree grows around him and encloses the sarcophagus. Isis now starts out to find her husband. And, she's a goddess, and somehow her intuition leads her. She comes to this place in Syria where Osiris is enclosed in the tree. Meanwhile, however, the prince of that little town has had a child. A little boy has been born, and the prince has built a palace. The wonderful aroma that comes from this tree has so entranced him that he has had the tree cut down and fashioned into a pillar in the palace. And so Osiris is in the palace in the form of a pillar. Well, Isis arrives, and she sits down by a well, and when the young women from the palace come out to draw water from the well, they invite this beautiful older woman in to become nurse for the child, for the newborn little prince. And then she said, and by the way, my husband's in that pillar. So she said, could you please give me the pillar so I can take my husband home? And the king, very polite, said, here you are, my darling. So there's Isis, you can tell by the throne on her head, and here's Osiris coming to her in the form of a pillar. He's put on the barge, and on the barge on the way back to the papyrus swamp, she takes off the lid and lies closely upon the dead Osiris and conceives Horus. Now, Osiris has two sons, one by Nephthys, Anubis, the jackal boy, and another by Isis, Horus. She is afraid to go back to the palace because Set has assumed the throne. She goes into the papyrus swamp and gives birth to her son Horus. Here she is in solitude giving birth, and the god Amun comes and Tot come and assist her in the pain of the delivery. So there she is, and Set now chasing a boar. He's hunting a boar, follows this boar into the papyrus swamp, and my lord, there is Isis with Osiris's corpse beside her. In a rage, he tears Osiris into 15 pieces, scatters the 15 pieces over the landscape, and poor Isis has to go hunt for him again. So she is helped now by Nephthys, who joins her, and little Anubis, the little jackal boy who sniffs around, and they get 14 of the 15 pieces. The dead Osiris is associated with the rising of the Nile, which fertilizes Egypt, and the juices of his disintegrating body are identified with the waters of the Nile, and it is he, therefore, that is the fertilizing force of Egypt. The 14 pieces are put together, and here's the little boy Anubis in the role later assumed by the priests embalming, who reassembles the body and embalms it. The piece that was missing is the genital organs, which have been swallowed by a fish. And this is the background of the fish meal on Fridays. It's a sacramental consuming of the sacred flesh. Osiris, now no longer being a generator, is the image of the dead pharaoh, and he becomes the lord of the underworld. The resurrected Osiris is now the judge of the dead in the underworld.
This is important because this theme of resurrection and rebirth are key to understanding the third degree of the Blue Lodge, also known as Master Mason. The reason why is because in the third degree is a ritual revolving around an individual named Hiram Abiff. Before I show a clip of the ritual, let me read an excerpt from the Ahamon Rizon. It was a single object of all the ancient rites and mysteries practiced in the very bosom of pagan darkness to teach the immortality of the soul. This is still the great design of the third degree of Masonry. This is the scope and aim of its ritual. The Master Mason represents man when youth, manhood, old age, and life itself have passed away as fleeting shadows, yet raised from the grave of iniquity and quickened into another and better existence. By its legend and all its ritual, it is implied that we have been redeemed from the death of sin and the sepulchre of pollution, and the conclusion we arrive at is that youth properly directed leads us to honorable and virtuous maturity, and that the life of man, regulated by morality, faith, and justice, will be rewarded at its closing hour by the prospect of eternal bliss. The important design of the degree is to symbolize the great doctrines of the resurrection of the body and the immortality of the soul. And hence, it has been remarked by a learned writer of our order that the Master Mason represents a man saved from the grave of iniquity and raised to the faith of salvation. Ultimately, what is meant by this ritual is to mimic the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The story of Jesus Christ is that he was a God and man, and that he lived on earth, was crucified and died, but then resurrected into something new, or the last Adam, as Paul calls him. I don't want to turn this into a theological lesson, although that may be unavoidable. But I believe the Freemasons have incorporated this idea of resurrection with the character Hiram Abiff, who is a type of Christ figure who Freemasons believe in to be saved. Renowned Masonic writer Albert Mackey states, "The Master Mason represents a man saved from the grave of iniquity and raised to the faith of salvation." Another Masonic author, W.L. Wilmhurst, asserts that the Master Mason degree inculcates the necessity of mystical death and dramatizes the process of such death and revival therefrom into newness of life. A Master Mason, then, in the full sense of the term, is no longer an ordinary man, but a divinized man, one in whom the universal and the personal consciousness have come into union. Obviously, the quality of life and consciousness of such a one must differ vastly from that of other men. His whole being is differently qualitated and geared upon another center. Professor of Scottish History at the University of St. Andrews, David Stevenson, in his comprehensive work, The Origins of Freemasonry, tells us, "A central theme in many initiation ceremonies was ritual death and rebirth. The transition celebrated being regarded as of such fundamental importance that it involved the candidate's death in one state and his birth into another. Putting these points together, it is likely that the 17th century Masonic ritual involved the candidate in some sort of ritual death and subsequent raising from the dead or being born again into the world of Masonry through being lifted from the grave in the 5 points of fellowship embrace. So we see in 2001: A Space Odyssey a similar theme in the idea of death and rebirth. Also important is the number 3, that there are 3 distinct stages to illumination. This is another theme in Masonry, that there is a veil that separates the uninitiated from the illumined person. This is an important theme because a theme of the Masonic belief is that one is going from darkness to light, or from west to east. The first thing to notice about the first monolith that we see in 2001: A Space Odyssey is that the shape of the monolith is positioned in such a way that it resembles a trapezoid. We see this same shape in the back of the dollar bill. It is a trapezoid shape with the eye at the top of the pyramid. This eye is shining, obviously, looking at this image here. The sun, of course, would represent the all-seeing eye. I think the crescent moon is suggestive of the fact that I think it represents the curvature of a shape of an eye. But this image is quite clear. This would represent the first degree of Freemasonry. Again, with the exception of quotes I'm giving from Kubrick himself, these are quotes from Freemasonic authors. Here's what Oliver Day Street says in Symbolism of the 3 Degrees. The state in which a candidate enters an entered apprentice lodge fittingly typifies the barbaric, not to say savage state in which man originally moved when he knew not the use of metals and out of which he has been brought to his present condition. It is precisely this that has led to the application of the term barbarian to the uninitiated. On this point we quote Brother Albert Pike again. He says, "That preparation of the candidate which symbolizes the condition of the Aryan race, especially in its infancy. He represents the condition of the race when there were no manufacturers and the fabrics of the loom were unknown, when men dressed in the skins of animals, and when the heat made these a burden, were hardly clothed at all. He represents their blindness of ignorance, even of the most useful arts, and altogether of divine truths, in that in which the number 3 appears, the bonds in which they were held of their sensual appetites, their passions that they were their masters, anger, revenge, hatred, and all the evil kindred of these, and their superstitious fears." It is, of course, the exposure with the monolith that Moonwatcher basically has become aware of the fact that he can use tools to basically get what he wants. Based on what we just read, he would no longer be termed a barbarian in a sense, because he has become illumined. Then we get this very famous piece. Everybody knows the music. The name of the piece is called Also Sprach Zarathustra. It's written by Strauss. What is interesting is that the music plays 3 times. You hear it first at the beginning. Second time you hear it is in this part. And of course the last time you hear it is at the very end. But we're not there yet, so I'll talk about that then. So Moonwatcher has realized that with a bone he can use it as a weapon of destruction. In a bit of morbid, triumphal glee, he throws the bone up into the air. This is when Kubrick transitions from the bone to a missile in space. It's his way of saying, even though we've advanced thousands of years, we haven't really got over the fact that we still need to fight each other, that there's still violence. Matter of fact, there's this whole tension going on in this scene between the United States and Russia. You have this one guy here, Dr. Haywood Floyd. This organization he's part of is kind of like a NASA type organization. They're not called NASA, but there's this one part where he is talking to this group of people, and he is explaining the need for a cover-up. They found something on the moon on Clavius, and they're not really sure what it is. They still need to investigate it, but they're not going to tell anybody about it. There's going to be this need for secrecy. What is interesting here is that there's a photographer here that, in a way, kind of looks like Kubrick. The photographer here actually shows up again on the moon with the group. This is interesting to me because secret societies are like anybody else. They want to have pictures taken. Now, before the age of photography, they had painting. Now here's a painting of a Freemasonic lodge. Now if you look in the very bottom right corner, that's supposedly Mozart. Here is an actual photograph of the Skull and Bones members. You'll notice former President George Bush. And here are some photographs of the Bohemian Grove. My point here is that you want to get somebody to take these pictures, and you're probably going to want to get somebody who's good at what they do. I'm guessing that somehow they hired Kubrick. They approached Kubrick and said, hey, we want you to do this for us. Take pictures. So I think Kubrick slipped this in here to let us know that this is like what he does, so that this is kind of representative of him. If you'll notice the guy's haircut and the way he kind of looks like Kubrick back in the day, before he got chunky and grew a beard. What's interesting is that in Eyes Wide Shut, there is a character named Nick Nightingale. Again, you have this idea of an artist who's hired by the secret groups to perform for them. Anyway, what's interesting to me is that the character of this photographer is inconsequential to the film. So why is he even in here? In my opinion, there has to be a reason, and I think that's the reason. That he represents Kubrick. Now just to diverge just a little bit here, there are some who think that Kubrick faked the moon landing. I don't think there's any way in hell to prove that. I really don't. It's a lot of speculation, and I can't say for certain. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this at the end of this video, but I will say this, that if anybody could do it, it would be Kubrick. I'll just give you one little example here. In the James Bond movie, The Spy Who Loved Me, in the tanker scene where the submarines are kept, they were having trouble with the lighting. So the call was made to Kubrick to come on down and help them fix the lighting situation. Well, he did. So like I said, if anyone could have faked the moon landing, it would have been Kubrick. So we go to this place on the moon, and there we see the second monolith. Now, this team is chumming around the monolith, taking pictures, and then all of a sudden, you hear this high-pitched squeal. And then you just get the caption, 18 months later. Now, just interesting about the number 18, if you take the number 18, you divide it by 3, you get 6, or 666. Does this mean anything? I don't know. But for a movie with a number in its title, this is the only time you'll find in the movie with a number that is similar in style to the opening credits. That being said, 2001 equals 3. Now this part, where the ship Discovery is headed towards Jupiter, we're introduced to two crewmen, Frank Poole and David Bowman, and also the ship's computer, named Hal. To be honest with you, you could really excise this whole section from the movie, and it wouldn't make much difference. Obviously you don't want to do that, but I'm just saying, you could if you wanted to. This whole bit about Hal going crazy isn't really integral to the whole idea of the film. What is important, though, is the character Dave Bowman. Take the character's name, for instance. His name is David Bowman. David is Hebrew for beloved. Bowman is somebody who shoots a bow. So, in a way, this is the beloved person who is aiming towards something. He's shooting. It is when he disconnects Hal that he realizes the lost word, or the hidden word, which is a revelation of what the team discovered on the moon. When you heard that high-pitched squeal, basically it was a transmission towards Jupiter. And so the ship itself was basically going to Jupiter towards that transmission. Now, this is when Dave Bowman goes towards Jupiter. It begins the Jupiter and Beyond the Infinite sequence, which is kind of a trippy Stargate type sequence. But of course, this is the third degree. This is the third monolith right here, this whole sequence. In Henry Wilson Coyle's Masonic Encyclopedia, he writes, "Light is everywhere, the symbol of intelligence, information, knowledge, and truth, and is opposed to darkness, which symbolizes ignorance and evil. So in the ceremonies, the candidate is said to be brought from darkness to light." I've read from several Freemasonic authors, and the idea here is the same, that the degrees represent or are symbolic of this transition from the early stages of life, which are a type of immaturity, from darkness into light. Now, we see this happening in an instant with Dave Bowman. We see Dave Bowman transitioning through these stages of life. He sees himself as an older man, and then yet as an older man, and we see him in a bed, and in front of him is the third monolith. And it is only when he sees this third monolith that he is reborn as the Star Child. And if you'll notice this Star Child, he's full of light, he's illumined. He's gone from darkness to light. He is a new creature. It's just like the clip I showed you from the Three Little Bops, where you got to get hot to play real cool. And what is light? It's energy, heat. And so, through this whole Masonic ritual, now has he become worthy. He has evolved from that state of barbarity. And notice also what is particularly interesting is that in one of the incarnations of Dave Bowman as an old man, we see that it looks like he has a Masonic apron on. And to quote Oliver Daystreet again, he says, "We believe, as we have several times observed, that it is susceptible of the clearest proof that Masonry, viewed in the aggregate, is an elaborate allegory of human life. The 3 degrees considered collectively, symbolically, epitomize man's existence both here and in the hereafter." Our excuse for recurring to this idea is that speculative Masonry cannot otherwise adequately be explained. The lodge is emblematical of the world, initiation of birth, the entered apprentice of the preparatory stage of life, or youth, the fellowcraft of the constructive stage, or manhood, the master mason of the reflective stage, or old age, death, the resurrection, and the everlasting life. This explanation of the 3 degrees is briefly given in our lecture on the 3 steps delineated on the master's carpet. Any symbol or any meaning attributed to a symbol which does not legitimately contribute to this allegory may be discarded as non-Masonic. There was a documentary, or shall I say mockumentary, called Dark Side of the Moon. Ultimately, the claim is that Stanley Kubrick faked the Apollo 11 moon landing. As I stated previously, this is something I don't really discuss, because I don't really know for sure. Again, there's a photographer in 2001 that I think is representative of Kubrick. I think this mockumentary is a very, very bizarre film. I think it is intentionally misleading, if only to reveal some truth, but that's my opinion. It's so ridiculous. The claims that are made are obviously false. Even some characters are false. But what if everyone is lying except Christiane Kubrick, the wife of Stanley Kubrick? What if she's not really talking about the moon landing, but some other involvement Kubrick had with the elite? If this film tells me anything, it is this. Kubrick may not have faked the moon landing, but he did something. I think it had to do with secret societies.
The big bad wolf, he learned the rules. You gotta get hot to play real cool.